Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow walk along a fence line, but not just any fence. This one runs the length of a colonial New England village. Its rails worn smooth by years of weather and hands, its posts leaning ever so slightly like old men eavesdropping on the street. It's late enough that the sun's no longer making promises about coming back soon. The light is going silver, the way it does when shadows stretch so far they meet in the middle. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows far too late in the day, either confused or simply contrary. You probably wouldn't survive long here without at least pretending you know the unspoken rules. One of which, oddly enough, is not lingering too long by certain fences. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location and the local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your boots crunch on the frost-tipped grass, and you run your fingers along the rough-hewn wood. It's oak or maybe chestnut timber brought down by axes that rang out last spring. Here, a fence isn't just a polite way of saying this is mine. That's yours. It's a piece of the landscape, a marker of survival. Without it, your crops might get trampled by a neighbor's cows or nibbled to stubs by wandering goats. Fences define not only property lines, but also the spaces where people meet and exchange gossip, though some fences are avoided entirely as if they belong more to whisperers than to landowners. You pass a spot where the rails dip low, almost inviting you to swing a leg over. It's just high enough to keep a sheep from hopping through, but low enough that a nimble person or something else could perch there, balancing with ease. It's a strange thought, and maybe it lingers because of the way the air feels here, a little heavier, a little colder than it should be. A crow wheels overhead, lets out a raspy call, then glides down to perch on the far post. It tilts its head, watching you like it knows something you don't. A few children dart across the path ahead, the laughter trailing behind them. But when they reach the next fence corner, they stop short, glance at it, and make a wide circle around. One boy whispers something you can't catch. Another spits into the dirt, a quick gesture that's part habit, part superstition. You've heard that spitting is a way to ward off bad luck. Though whether it's bad luck from fences or from what sits on them, no one will say outright. The settlement itself seems to lean inward, buildings huddled close as though they too want to stay within safe bounds. Beyond the last row of houses, you see a field stretching toward the tree line, its border marked by a long split-rail fence that disappears into the shadowed woods. The rails gleam faintly with frost, each one catching the moonlight like a line drawn on parchment. Get the unsettling impression that if you watched long enough, you might see movement where there shouldn't be any, something balancing perfectly on the narrow rail, scanning the fields with patient, unblinking eyes. Smell of wood smoke drifts from a nearby chimney, mingling with the sharp temps of cold earth. Somewhere behind you, a door closes softly. The village is settling in for the night, shutters latched, hearths stoked. But here on the edge of the road, beside the old fence, the night feels less settled, like it has room for oddities. Trace the grain of the nearest post with your fingertips, noticing faint gouges near the top, as if claws or nails had gripped it. Too high for a dog, too deliberate for weathering. You step back, not because you're afraid, but because the fence suddenly feels less like an object and more like a participant. Historians still argue whether these old superstitions about fences in colonial America came purely from European folklore, or if they blended with indigenous beliefs about boundaries and spirits. Whatever the origin, here under the pale wash of the moon, the argument feels less important than the atmosphere of this thin, quivering space between home and the unknown. You keep walking, but the fence line follows, its rails stretching ahead like an unrolled scroll you've yet to read. Asterisk, the fence keeps you company as the path narrows, each post leaning toward you like it's trying to share a secret in a voice. Just beyond hearing, wood smells faintly of sap, though it's long since been cut and seasoned by years of rain, snow, and the occasional neighbor's donkey rubbing an itchy shoulder against it. You notice how the rails here are smoother, almost polished? The kind of sheen that comes from repeated contact boots, skirts, maybe even bare feet, if the stories are to be believed. In the faint moonlight, your mind drifts back to the first time you overheard someone mutter about riding the fence. It wasn't said like an insult or a political dig, it was murmured in the same tone people reserve for talking about illnesses they can't quite name. In early America, that phrase could be quite literal, which, as the tales went, didn't just ride broomsticks. Sometimes they were said to straddle a fence rail and let the devil's power carry them. Almost like the fence itself was a launch pad into the night. The explanation for why is less clear. Some folks claimed it gave them a view over both fields, physical and supernatural, like perching between two worlds. Others believe the act marked territory, much like scratching a symbol into a doorway or tucking a charm under the hearthstone. The fence, being both boundary and threshold, is the perfect stage for such a display. You reach a bend where the fence line breaks for a narrow stile, two flat stones set like steps over the rails. Here, the grass is shorter, trampled by passers-by. But the post nearest the stile has odd markings. By daylight, you might think them natural knots in the wood, but in this pale light, they look deliberate, small, intersecting cuts, forming something between a star and a wheel. Protective symbols, maybe, or warnings. Historians still argue whether early Americans borrowed such carvings from English and Scottish folk traditions, or if they simply evolved from the habit of marking any place deemed thin between worlds. Fox slips across the path ahead of you, its paws silent on the frozen ground. It pauses just long enough to glance at the fence before vanishing into the underbrush. You find yourself doing the same, casting a glance down the rail as though expecting a figure to be waiting there. In the silence that follows, you catch the faintest creak, wood shifting under weight. Could be the wind. Could be something else. You imagine the scene centuries ago, a woman in a heavy wool skirt, her breath making ghosts in the air, slipping from her cottage after the hearth has died to embers. She'd crossed the yard without a lantern, guided by the silver edge of moonlight on frost. At the fence, she'd swing a leg over, settle herself astride the rail, begin murmuring words the neighbors wouldn't dare write down. The fence wouldn't just hold her, it would become part of the act. A spine of wood and iron nails channeling her will outward, whether to bless, curse, or simply travel. The stories never quite agree. You touch the rail again and notice how cold it feels, almost unnaturally so compared to the air. There's no frost on this section, though it's just as exposed as the rest. A trick of the wind, perhaps. Or maybe this is one of those spots that locals pass quickly, pretending not to notice. You recall the boy who circled wide earlier. Maybe this was the place. The land dips slightly here, and the fence seems to sag along with it, the rails forming a gentle slope toward the darker edge of the woods. The tree branches beyond sway just enough to scatter patches of moonlight across the ground, light that flashes silver on the rail tops. For a moment, it's easy to picture the old superstitions. Someone riding here, barely moving, as though the fence itself was sliding them forward toward some unseen destination. From somewhere far off, a barn door bangs shut. You're reminded that most fences here weren't purely for privacy, they were as practical as they were symbolic. Keeping livestock in meant keeping predators, both natural and supernatural, out, or so the stories claimed. A cow gone missing could be blamed on wolves, sure, but in a pinch, which was just as likely to take the blame, especially if she'd been spotted near a fence the night before. The wind picks up, and with it comes the smell of damp leaves and chimney soot. Continue along the path, the fence a constant presence, until it disappears briefly behind a copse of trees. The absence feels strange, like walking without a shadow. And when the fence reappears, there's a fresh rail newer, wood paler, the grain still sharp. Someone's been repairing it. You wonder if they know or care about the stories. Maybe. They replaced the rails for the same reason their ancestors did not, because they were broken, but because they'd been sat on too often by something they'd rather not think about. The newer section of fence feels wrong under your hand. not in the sinister sense, but in that slightly disappointing way you feel when you find a restored piece of history scrubbed to clean. The splinters are fresh, the nails shine faintly in the moonlight, and the rails give off the faint scent of cut pine, sharp and almost sweet. It doesn't hold the same weight as the older rails. It's the ones with grooves worn in by decades of weather and who knows what else. Still, you notice how the new wood stops abruptly, and the fence transitions back into its older self, darkened. With age, the grain softened, the surface bearing those same mysterious cuts you spotted earlier. The pattern repeats every so often. A wheel, a star, sometimes just a series of slashes. Mainstream historians will tell you these marks are likely carpenter's notches or tally marks for repairs. But there's a fringe theory, one of those, whispered over coffee rather than written in textbooks, that says they're part of a code, kind of warning to fellow practitioners. Historians still argue whether such symbols were an imported European witchmark tradition, or something that grew uniquely in the soil of the New World. The moon has climbed a little higher, its light spilling across the frost-speckled grass, making the fence gleam in broken silver lines. You imagine how it would look to someone riding it, how the shifting moonlight could make the rails appear as a continuous glowing path, leading you out of the village, or maybe right into its heart. A gust of wind rattles the bare branches, and you hear something else, a faint tapping, rhythmic and oddly patient. Following the sound, you spot a small farmhouse set back from the fence, its windows shuttered tight. The tapping stops the moment you notice it, as if the house itself is aware of being watched. The only movement now is a strip of laundry swaying from a line beside the house sod. It's given the hour. As you draw closer to the fence line opposite the farmhouse, you notice a post set lower than the rest. It's worn smooth at the top, the wood slightly concave from repeated pressure, as though someone has sat here many times. You picture a figure leaning forward, chin resting on her hands, gazing across the field toward the house, maybe watching for a sign or waiting for someone or something. The air feels heavier here, a subtle pressure against your ears, like being underwater for just a moment. It's not frightening exactly, more like the sensation of stepping into a place where the rules bend a little. You think of the fence again, not just as a boundary, but as a perch, a threshold, maybe even a tool. In European folklore, witches were sometimes said to straddle gates or thresholds to harness liminal energy, places that are neither fully one thing nor another. The fence running endlessly between properties might be the perfect conduit. Rest your hand on the worn post and look down the length of the fence. It disappears into the dark, interrupted only by the occasional glint of metal where nails catch the moonlight. It's quiet, no tapping, no wind, just the faint, far-off call of an owl. The sound echoes oddly, as though bouncing off invisible walls in the corner of your vision. Something shifts, a pale movement along the far stretch of the fence. You turn your head, but it's gone. Could have been a bird, could have been your imagination, the way you're reminded of the stories, where the fence was less about riding to travel and more about riding to be seen, to make a statement, so let the neighbors know without knocking on their door that certain boundaries were being tested and certain powers claimed. Stepping away from the post, you feel the faint tug of reluctance, the way you do when leaving a place you're not sure you understand but want to. The fence seems to follow you with its presence, always just to your right, its rails a companion, or maybe a witness. You keep walking, and in the darkness ahead, the posts begin to lean again, as if bending toward you, eager to share another secret. Asterisk, you keep your palm on the rail, as if it's a handrail for time. The fence obliges, guiding you uphill toward a cluster of houses whose chimneys breathe like patient oxen. If the stories about riding fences feel homegrown, they're not. They arrived packed in trunks right beside kettles and salters, and the sturdy sense that a fence should mind its business. What crossed the Atlantic with the colonists wasn't just the habit of hedging fields. It was the whole vocabulary of witch-lore, gate perching, threshold straddling, night riding, all the ways people in the old country imagined power slipping along the edges of ordinary life. Mainstream historical fact keeps pace beside you. The settlers who built these rails were steeped in European beliefs. English, Scots-Irish, Dutch, German, where witches were said to travel at night, sometimes on broomsticks, sometimes on fence rails or gates, and where liminal places hedges, stiles. Crossroads made excellent runways. The word hedge itself, in Hedge Witch and Hedge Rider. Framed magic is something practiced on the boundary between cultivated land and the wild. Transplant that world to New England, swap hawthorn hedges for split rails and pasture fences, and the old image snaps neatly into place. Night, wood, a narrow perch that's half home, half dash outside. You picture an English villager telling a New World neighbor. Over a shared mug of cider, how old Nan and their parish used to sit the gate when the moon was right and the butter wouldn't come. People didn't carve treatises. They traded stories like recipes, adjusted for ingredients on hand. No hedges? Fine rails will do. No mossy style? A corner post works? The principle stays unchanged. Ride the line. Borrow the lines in between us. The fence under your fingers gives the tiniest creakwood. Drying after a day's damp hand, you think of the Puritan sermons you've read, stern as granite about, keeping to the straight path and not consorting with the powers of the air. Those same congregations, practical to the marrow, also kept a weather eye on the night. Theologically, they distrusted superstition. Pastorally, they noticed that Mrs. Morton swore she'd seen a figure balanced on the rail behind the north pasture. And wouldn't you know it, the cow wouldn't cross thereafter. Belief can be paradoxical without feeling dishonest. Joke 1. If colonial life were a Facebook status, its relationship with superstition would be its complicated. A breeze stirs the grass, and you remember another imported idea. The hag-ridden night, here in parts of Britain. Waking from sleep paralysis or nightmare came with the feeling of a weight on the chest. The witch sat on me, people said. In America, that phrase took root as witch riding or the hags on your back, and it didn't stop with humans. Farmers swore that a witch rode their horses at night, tangled manes, elf locks, foam on the flank, the animal, skittish at the morning's first light. Quirky tidbit, some households braided a few hairs and tied them with red thread before dusk. It's a simple no trespassing sign in equine language. Others sprinkled salt by the stall door or hung an iron, key above the threshold. Iron is the old world's version of airport security. You rest a boot on the lower rail and look toward the dark tree line. In Europe, the image of the Sabbath on the moor or mountain gathered its own mythology. Here, space rearranged the story. The meeting might be imagined in a clearing, across a river ford, or so some swore right along a fence that divided. Commons from pasture. Fences were the geometry of the settlement's conscience. Who owed what? Who could graze where? Who cut timber past their allowance? Put power on that line. The community's nerves hummed. Historians still argue whether the fence-riding tale in America reflects genuine folk belief widely shared, or whether it blooms from a narrower set of anxieties recorded because they made good courtroom copy. The big trials, Salem especially, gave us transcripts heavy with night rides and spectral visits. But it's hard to tell if those stories were common currency on the street or magnified by legal theater. Some scholars argue for a broad-lived folklore. Others see a more localized panic dressed in imported motifs. You stand with the rails and decide the wood doesn't care which camp wins. It remembers weight either way. A dog barks twice from the next farm, and then, apparently satisfied that it has done a full audit of the universe, goes silent. You imagine neighbors at a winter spinning bee swapping yarn and yarns. The old country women passing on patterns both for stockings and for telling the night where to go. Broomsticks get the headlines, sure, but fences are the understudies that never miss a Q-cheap, available and photogenic in the moon. The colonial press helped, too. Almanacs and chapbooks carried snippets of British and German tales. Traveling preachers repeated cautionary examples that stuck better than doctrine. Narratives, like burrs cling to wool across an ocean still. Burrs. You stop where two lines of rail meet at a tidy angle. And for a moment, the join looks like an arrow pointing outward. The woods, the ocean, the unknown beyond. Migration itself is a liminal act, to leave one edge and arrive at another. Fence riding as an image is migration in miniature. One leg on this side, one on that, the body choosing both until it lifts. No wonder the rumor felt right to communities straining to draw bright lines around new lives. There's a small scar on the top rail at the corner, a patch where the wood looks lighter, less weathered. You brush it with your thumb and feel a shallow groove, as if someone once carved a looped knot and then sanded it back, unsure whether to leave the charm visible. That hesitancy is its own story. The Puritan ethic discouraged vain marks. But people are human. Their hands make little prayers even when their lips practice restraint. Joke 2. You resolve that if your hand ever carves a loop on a rail, you'll call it a maintenance notation and keep walking. Mainstream fact returns with a companion from folk medicine. Cunning folk, the informal healers and charmers, made the journey to. Not all settled ministers approved, but communities with more chores than ours quietly consulted whoever could untie a knot of trouble. If a fence corner felt ridden, a charm might be nailed, their rowan twig bent nail, even a scrap of scriptural verse folded small. The language of protection was bilingual. Bible and hedgerow, psalm and pin. You think about how the image persisted even after towns grew and pastures shrank. Long into the 19th century, New Englanders wrote of witch-ridden nights and hag-ridden beasts. The fence stayed in the mental wallpaper even when stone walls began to replace rails. Stories are excellent at surviving technology upgrades. When rails rotted and were replaced with posts and wire, the rumor adapted perched on the gate, hovered by the latch, left hoof marks where no horse had a right to walk. Joke 3. If the rumor could use email, it would see the whole parish, eh? A thin band of cloud drifts over the moon, and the fence dims to a charcoal line. You test the top rail with your palm, feeling the flex, the spring the wood still carries. For a second, you do the impolite thing and imagine how a body might balance. Here, knees hugging wood, hands on the post's worn cap, breath frosting forward. Would you feel power, or only the odd tilt of seeing your world from between? That, perhaps, was the unsettling part for the neighbors. Anyone poised on the rail can look over both fields. Ownership in that posture becomes negotiable. Communities prefer fewer negotiations after sunset. Somewhere a latch lifts and falls. The sound carries like a skipped heartbeat. Follow the fence a few more paces, the rails keeping time with your steps. Cross the ocean, hedges still whisper their old lines. Here the rails answer in their own accent. The story they carry of rides of watching, of boundaries both wooden and imagined. Sits lightly on the night, a shawl rather than a chain. You wrap it around your shoulders anyway, because it's colder than it looks. And because a little borrowed lore never hurt a traveler with more road to walk. The rails slope gently downhill now, angling toward a low meadow where the grass lies flat and swirls from the last rain. You notice how the moonlight catches on the damp stalks, making them glisten like someone scattered tin shavings in the dark. Fences here are leaner than the ones up near the houses, just enough to suggest a boundary, not enough to stop anything. Truly determined, and maybe that's the point. A fence like this feels less like a wall and more like a polite reminder. Here's where one thing ends and another begins. Unless you're a witch, in which case carry on. Mainstream historical fact: in early colonial settlements, especially those pressed close to marshland or open fields, fences often marked the edge of common land. These were spaces shared by the community for grazing, woodcutting, or, in theory, open passage. But in the language of superstition, such in-between zones were like open invitations. Witches in European folklore were said to favor places that blurred ownership liminal spaces where rules grew thin. Transplanted to the colonies, that idea stuck like burrs on wool. A rail over open ground could be the perfect perch for someone, or something neither entirely here nor entirely gone. A quirky tidbit you'd miss unless you asked the oldest person in the room. Some households swore you could tell. If a fence had been ridden by the way the dew dried, if a long narrow patch along the top rail was bone dry while the rest still glistened, that was proof enough for some that a witch had passed in the night. Farmers might rub that spot with garlic or vinegar before sunrise, muttering the Lord's Prayer for good measure. Historians still argue whether this dew sign was ever more than neighborly gossip. But it shows how the mind scans for patterns in the quiet hours before breakfast. You stop where a narrow footpath cuts across the rails. A gap closed by. A crude wooden stile 2 steps up, a flat board 2 steps down, The wood is worn smooth in the middle from years of use. Someone once carved a simple five-pointed star into the style's top edge, now softened by time. In England, that might have been a daisy wheel or witch mark. It's common in barns and doorways. But here, it feels almost accidental, an echo of a practice the carver didn't entirely understand but still felt worth doing. The night air is heavy enough to feel like a presence. And you think about the double life these boundaries lead. By day, they're just rails and boards. By night, they become stages for whatever the imagination wants to see. Joke 1. By this hour, even a raccoon on a fence starts to look suspicious. Some colonists blended their imported folklore with the observations they made here. They noticed that owls like to perch on rails, their silhouettes eerily human if you only caught a glimpse. They noticed how foxes could walk along the top plank of a fence for a few steps, tails high before dropping silently into the grass. And they noticed how the wind, funneled through gaps, could make the rails hum in a way that was strangely like a low voice. Add darkness, a tired mind, and a little neighborly warning, and you've got yourself a witch story without needing an actual witch. Down in the meadow, the fence ends at a corner post taller than the rest. It leans slightly toward you as though inviting conversation. In some tales, this would be the launch point, the place where the rider gathers there, balance before setting off along the rails. In others, it's where they'd stop, still as a weather vane, listening for the next opportunity. You can't help but imagine both versions. Mainstream fact returns with the role of writing and accusations. In several recorded witchcraft cases, not only in Salem but in smaller towns, testimony included images of witches riding fences, beams or rails to travel invisibly or attend gatherings. Whether this was literal in the accuser's mind or a metaphor for other forms of trespass, it stuck because it fit neatly into the community's mental map of danger. The edge of your space was the most likely place for trouble to start. Quirky detail. Some people pounded nails into the top of certain fence posts, not to strengthen them, but to snag a witch's garments if she tried to pass. The belief was that once caught even by the hem, she couldn't leave until spoken to in God's name. Scholars still debate whether this practice was widespread or just a localized bit of fence post paranoia. You trail your fingers along the rail, feeling the ridges of the grain under the weathering. The idea that someone might ride this in the dead of night feels absurd in one breath and inevitable in the next. People look for signs in whatever landscape they have. In England, it's the hedgerow. In Germany, it's the stable door. In early America, it's the fence over wet meadow. The medium changes. The message stays the same. Watch the edges. The wind shifts and you smell the river before you see it, a mix of mud, fish, and that faint metallic Thames water. Gets under a low moon. The fence here runs right into the bank and stops, as though it's decided the water can be its own boundary. Think of all the crossings, real and imagined, that start at points like this. A witch might dismount here and step into a boat or vanish into the reeds, or if the story wants a little flourish, walk straight across the water's skin. You stand for a while, letting the quiet take over. Somewhere a frog croaks. Somewhere else, a horse stamps in its stall. The fence for now holds no riders, but the idea of them is so settled into the wood and into the minds of those who built it that you half expect to glance back later and see the rails trembling, as though something just leaped away. Joke 2. You tell yourself that if you do see that, you'll call it local wildlife and get on with your evening. For now, you turn away from the river, following the fence back toward the higher ground, each step bringing you closer to the heart of the village and, you suspect, closer to someone who will tell you exactly what they've seen at night, whether or not it's true. You follow the fence up toward higher ground, and the rails begin to feel less like wood and more like a long humming string stretched across the village. Maybe it's the breeze, thin and steady, slipping through the gaps in a way that turns every joint into a mouth, but once you notice it, you can't unhear it. A low, threadbare tone, as if the fence is practicing a hymn it only half remembers. You rest your palm on a post and feel, not movement exactly, but that odd awareness your hand gets when it touches something that has been touched 1,000 times before. Old attention lingers. It leaves a temperature behind. By daylight, fences. Do farm work? By moonlight, the stories give them side gigs. People here talk about rails the way sailors talk about currents, how power slips along them, gathers at corners, pools at gates. The wood won't confess to any of this, but the human ear is generous with what it thinks it hears. Would attest another. Post holder. Denser. The grain rising like topo lines, and try to imagine the fence as a giant diagram energy riding the grain. Slipping from knot to knot, catching at iron nails the way burrs catch at wool. You're not here to audit the physics. You're here to listen to the local feeling that the rails are more than the sum of their splinters. Mainstream historical fact steps in with its sensible shoes. Early American fences, especially the zigzag worm or split rail kind, were commonly made of chestnut or oak, with rails notched and stacked so they stayed up without digging post holes in rocky soil. Those rails did conduct attention. Travelers rested on them. Neighbors leaned to trade news. Children balanced along them. To learn coordination and a tiny bit of courage. If you're hunting a path for any idea to travel, gossip, warning, blessing. Blight, you could do worse than the village's longest continuous line. You try out the idea with your eyes closed. A whisper set on the rail at the north field. Caught by a knot, nudged along by wind, tugged at each triangle corner, until hours later, it reaches the gate by the meeting house, thinner, but intact. It isn't science. People map the invisible onto what they know how to build. Joke 1. Somewhere a fence is petitioning the utilities board to be recognized as emotional infrastructure. Quirky tidbit, courtesy of the oldest almanacs and the younger rumor mill. Some households swore that if you hammered an extra nail just one, crooked on purpose into the top rail at a troublesome corner, it would trip whatever ran. Along the line, the thing wasn't to stop power exactly, but to make it stagger. The way a knot in a carpet will snag your toe and make you remember your manners. Others tied a single horsehair strand from rail to rail at ankle height, invisible in low light, a spider string gate for forces that needed a moment of pause. The idea wasn't to trap so much as to tangle buying time for a whispered psalm, or a quick go with God, but go. Historians still argue whether this notion of rails as carriers of power was widespread. Belief or a patchwork of local hunches stapled together by later collectors of folklore? Some see a New World remix of older European hedge, Laura Place living hawthorn with dead chestnut, keep the boundary magic. Others think we're reading too much into repair marks and neighborly precautions. A rail is just a rail until a story. Wants it for a stage? The paper record is skimpy. The anecdotal record is a casserole of certainty and guesswork. You pass a corner where the fence makes a tidy V, and the air there feels different, like the wind has to choose between two exits. A recent rail shows 3 small scorches spaced like finger joint staper marks, maybe. Or the kind of weather staining that becomes superstition as soon as someone names it. A woman's voice comes from the path behind you, the tone practical. As a kitchen shelf, corners hold, she says, stepping past with a lidded pail. Good and bad both like to sit. She taps the rail with 2 knuckles not knocked for luck hand, keeps going, the way you secure a thought with a pin so it doesn't flutter. Your palm picks up a sweetness where sap once wept. A reminder that this was a living thing in the not-so-distant past. It's easier, then, to imagine the fence as a kind of wooden nerve, a felt line that knows when you touch it, that learns the village's pulse by being the place everyone rests a hip or a worry. If power flows where attention goes, the rail is a river in all seasons. Near a small gate, you find a charm nailed under the latch. 2 thin twigs crossed and bound with red thread. The red faded toward brick. Maybe rowan, maybe just whatever the maker had to hand. The intent is the same. In some families, they'd renew this binding on a change of season or after a quarrel that attached to the boundary. If the fence was a conduit, the gate was a switch on is careless. Off is tended. Joke 2. You consider making a little placard boundary powered by seasonal maintenance. Expect minor miracles. Mainstream fact loops back with the wider Atlantic world. Iron has a long resume. As award horseshoes above thresholds, keys under pillows, knives under cradles in some European homes, colonists packed those habits with the spoons and psalms. An iron nail in a rail placed with a muttered verse is just the threshold practice gone horizontal. If the evil rides the line, let it meet iron the way sparks meet water. There's no guarantee implied, only a preference asserted. Communities run on preferences that people are willing to enact at dusk. On a rise, the fence skirts a small burial ground field stones at the head, lichen spelling the years slowly. The rails here are sturdier, as if the carpenter had more too. Say someone has cut shallow daisies into the top face's petals, looping back on themselves, endless little circuits. It's the familiar hexafoil from door lintels, now translated to the village's long edge. You run a fingertip around one until you return to your starting point loop. Loop, loop, hand. Feel the mind ease at the predictability. The charm is less about trapping a thing than teaching your thoughts to walk in circles until they tire and lie down. Beyond the stones, the fence angles toward a swampy bit where frogs practice bass clef. The rails sag. Someone has propped them with extra stakes that lean like old friends. You spot a bundle of something tucked into a crook curbs tied with flax, brittle now, the scent long flown. Whether it's rosemary or a handful of marsh, grass consecrated by intention, the message is the same. We noticed this spot. We wrote our name here in plant language. Not all signatures are ink. Historians still argue whether talk of power lines was metaphor or sincere metaphysics. In the 18th century, you start to see dowser's water witches with forked sticks move across the landscape, reading the ground's moods like a pulse. Some later storytellers retrofitted that sensibility backward onto rails, imagining energy paths everywhere, mapped by anything long and straight. The earlier colonists likely wouldn't have used the term energy. They would have said virtue, influence, sympathy, blessing, malice. Different nouns. Same itch to describe a traffic you feel but cannot see. You pause where two rails cross over a little rivulet and listen as water needles the air. The sound climbs the wood as easily as it climbs your spine. If the fence is a string, the brook plucks it. You think of households who claim they could hear trouble approach through the rails, a faint thrumming like bees in a distant hedge. Quirky tidbit: some folks put a pewter spoon's bowl against the rail and the handle to an ear to bring the sound closer. A colonial stethoscope for boundary murmurs, whether they heard anything beyond wind. The act itself tuned there. Attention, the first condition for any magic worth keeping. A fox crosses again, tail sketching punctuation on the meadow, and hops onto the lowest rail for 2 delicate steps before dropping light as a glove. That perhaps is the most persuasive. Argument for why fences became power stories. Animals already use them as highways. People watch, then narrate. See how it goes along? A father might say everything follows the line. He'll mean foxes, wind, rumor, hope. He'll mean you too, apparently, because you're still walking beside this long wooden sentence, as if you expect it to reach a period that explains everything. Joke 3. You resolve that if the fence does produce a grand revelation, you'll pretend you knew it all along and nod gravely. At the next turn, you find a post capped. With a little iron staple bent into a near circle, your finger fits it neatly. Someone wanted a closed-shape Hera loop to keep what passes from unraveling. You stand a moment with the loop warming under your touch and realize the night has evened out. The hum you thought you heard at the start has merged with crickets. Your breath, the far-off creak of a signboard in village wind. Maybe power did travel the rail tonight. Maybe the only thing traveling is your attention. It's unspooling along the wood until it feels held by something longer than worry. You let your hand fall and step on. The fence easing you back toward houses, lamps, and the savory rumor of a late stew. Whether the rails carry anything more than stories, they've done their steady job. They have accompanied you, drawn a line you could keep, and gathered your frayed edges into a shape. The posts lean. Kindly, the rails remember every palm, and the night decides, you are not the sort of trouble that needs tripping. Asterisk. The fence eases you back toward the lived-in parts of the village lamp glow at window edges. Hearth smoke taking a slow, thoughtful walk up into the night. Here the rails pick up small additions, like jewelry on a plain coat, a twist of thread, At a knot, an iron nail hammered sideways, a thorn stuck into the grain like a punctuation mark that means turn back if you can read this. If which riding needs a runway, neighbors have decided to put a few traffic cones on it. You start to notice the pattern once your eye learns the grammar. Every so many posts, a nailhead gleams where there isn't much call for hardware halfway. Up, at a spot no gate latch would need. The nail is not driven home. It's left a little proud, as if the maker wanted the world to snag on it. Quirky tidbit the night offers with a conspirator's wink. Some households swore a nail, angled against the expected direction of travel, would catch the hem of a witch's skirt or the edge of a shadow in a hurry. Long enough for whoever heard the scuffle to speak God's name, whether it's physics, faith, or pure nerve. The effect is the same. Some problems break eye contact. When you call them by their wrong name, mainstream historical fact walks in with a sensible lantern. Throughout the English Atlantic world, iron was considered prophylactic horseshoes above thresholds, keys beneath pillows, knives laid under cradles, blade away naturally. The belief sailed over with the rest of the baggage. Nails and rails are just the threshold habit turned sideways. In inventories and household letters, you find iron doing steady duty is good for fear, especially where animals were concerned. If a stable door gets a shoe on it, why shouldn't the long wooden line that everything perches on? You pause at a corner where the fence makes a tidy elbow and find a small bouquet tied beneath the top rail. Not flowers, but twigs hawthorn, and something that looks like blackthorn, their little spikes still needling the air. Someone has wound red thread around the bundle just enough to make a deliberate cross. The bundle is tucked where a hand wouldn't brush it casually. Knows its job? Puncture what sails too close? You test the air with your palm and feel nothing but a prickle of suggestion, which is half the point. Joke 1. You consider tying a polite note beside it. Dear Malice, this is a coat with many hooks. A woman in a wool shawl appears through the gap in a hedge, carrying a small basket and the sort of determined calm that gets bread baked and cows coaxed. She stands at the rail and removes from the basket a sprig of rowan or its nearest colonial cousin, a twist of linen, and a nail with a thimble of rust on it. Bad dreams have been walking, she says to no one in particular. They step along. The sprig goes under the binding of an old knot. The nail goes in at a sideways slant. The linen makes one neat loop and a half. There's no muttered drama, only the soft diction of habit. Then she taps the rail twice with her knuckle there and moves on, the way you might set a kettle. Farther from the edge because you'd rather not be sorry. You follow her work with your eyes and start to see how the village has been combing the long line against the nap of trouble. At one post, someone has drawn a small circle in chalk-no, bigger than a coin, then pricked it with 3 teeny constellations that will wash away by morning and be redrawn the next damp. At another, you find a dangling charm cut from tin, whether pocked into a silver that refuses to choose between dull and bright. It's shaped like a 5-pointed star and hangs from a short wire so it can spin when the breeze needs something. 2. If power rides the line, the village is making it dizzy on purpose. Historians still argue whether these measures had a coherent, shared doctrine, or were an untidy bouquet of family customs, grandmother's thorn, neighbor's nail, someone's half-remembered prayer from far away. Folklorists love a tidy typology. Villages prefer whatever keeps the night quiet. You can hear the debate in the paper record, ministers frowning at superstition, magistrates ignoring it unless it brews the peace while the rails keep. Collecting small decisions you can't legislate, a twist of red here, to scrap a psalm there, iron wherever the hand thought. This is thin ground. At a gate you find a fringe of dried herbs threaded through the crevice where the latch drops. The scent is faint but familiar. Rosemary and something sharper, maybe rue or tansy. The bundle has been pushed in just far enough that a casual passerby wouldn't see it. Only someone in the habit of peering at hinges would. You remember the porch door at the church and the little stealthy posies tucked where wood meets stone. Out here the logic is horizontal. The gate is a mouth, so you brush its teeth. Joke 2. You decide that if a fence could floss, it would do it at the noisiest possible hour. Mainstream fact loops back with livestock. Logic. Colonists blamed night riding not only for dreams, but for animals found hag-ridden, manes tangled, backs sweat-matted, temper ruined by dawn. Countermeasures clustered where horse and cow met the open line. You spot one now. A length of braided horsehair tied to the top rail, ends left long so they flick in the breeze. Hair catches burrs, catches static, catches the eye, if the rider is of the tangle first. Ask questions later, class of trouble. This will oblige. Next to it, a small bent pin is stuck into the wood, humble cousin to the iron nail cheap, sharp, and dedicated to snagging what scoffs at courtesy. A boy slips from the shadow of a shed with a candle stub and a tin cup, the flame wearing its own small halo of smoke. He crouches at a post and warms a gobbet of beeswax between finger and thumb, then smears it over an old crack until the seam goes glossy. He doesn't even glance up to see if you're watching. To him, this is fence care, the way you oil a hinge. The squeak you silence may be mechanical, or it may be the kind of complaint that keeps grandparents awake. The wax cools to a dull honey, and the boy breathes on it once for luck. As if breath were the ride, the charm needs to go the rest of the way. You come upon a fence corner where someone has given up on subtlety and nailed a small iron horseshoe right to the post. Open and down. In some places, that would be an arrow, spill your luck. People would cluck, but here, the open mouth seems to drink the line. It's if luck is a thing you pour into a boundary until it sloshes back at whatever sips the other way. A tiny scrap of paper is tucked under one nail. You don't pry, but you catch the tail of a verse. Deliver us from, that's enough. The rest is understood. A gust moves through, and the tin star spins, flashing brief mute signals into the lane. You picture a night rider taking the rail like an arrow and meeting in 20 paces. Nail, thorn, hair, wax. A whiff of rosemary, a chalk dot, an iron loop, and a horseshoe that refuses to pick a doctrine but will happily interfere. None of these things are dramatic. All of them say the same. We're watching our edges. The village doesn't need unanimous belief. It needs converging habits. Together, they make the fence thicker than wood. Quirky tidbit, tucked in a family recollection you once heard on certain nights, Easter Eve, midsummer, or when the aurora did unruly things, some households laid a green switch across the top. Rail the wrong way round, but to the direction of travel, tip pointing back toward the house. They swore it turned harm, the way you turn an animal with a stick laid across its path. Practical shepherding meets metaphysical husbandry. If you can steer a goat with a twig, perhaps you can steer mischief with one too. You find yourself doing little helper gestures without thinking, pressing a twig deeper where someone placed it, straightening a loose knot, wiping a wet bead off the head of a nail so it doesn't rust quite so fast. None of this is necessary. All of it feels courteous. Fence with ornaments becomes a fence with manners. Joke 3. You briefly consider opening a boutique apothecary for boundaries, specializing in tasteful thorns and artisanal crooked nails. Historians still argue whether the countermeasures truly changed behavior or merely gave people back their nights. Diaries sometimes credit a charm for quieting the stable. Other times they shrug and say, the mare is better now. Efficacy is slippery in the dark, and yet the repetition suggests benefit of a measured kind. Hands occupied, minds steadied. Neighbors united by a shared to-do list small enough to finish before the kettle sings. By the time you reach the green, the rail line wears its small arsenal like a string of calm beads, touchstone, thorn, iron, breath, herb. You trail your fingers along the top rail one last time and feel how the wood, for all its quiet, thrums with the sum of attention paid to it. Countermeasures may never make a pamphlet, but they make a practice. Practice, more than panic, is what strengthens a village spine. You turn toward the meeting house, where a door sits ajar and warm light puddles on the step. Behind you, the fence resumes its long hush, the iron and thorn minding the lane with an etiquette older than accusation and younger than dawn. Whatever rides into a corridor of small no thank yous, and sometimes that is all the miracle required. The meeting house greets you with the dry creak of its hinges, the kind of sound that feels almost polite, just enough noise to announce you, not enough to scold you for coming late. Inside, the air is a quilt of scents, beeswax from the candles, oak dust from the pews, a faint ghost of last Sunday's wet coats, steaming in the heat. You glance around and see the usual business hymnals stacked in neat disorder. A broom leaned against the wall like it's eavesdropping, and at the far end, near the main doorway. The thing you came for? It's easy to miss, at first. Which is exactly the point. Carved marks, shallow and overlapping, just at knee height on the heavy oak jamb. Not letters. Not decoration. More like loops and crosses that have been drawn without lifting the hand, repeated until they seem to have grown into the wood grain. Some swirl like vines, curling in on themselves. Others meet in crisp intersections, forming shapes that could be flowers, or could be something that flowers imitate. Mainstream historical fact steps in with its sensible shoes. These are apotropaic, marks ritual protection symbols common in English churches from the medieval period through the colonial era. Known sometimes as daisy wheels or hexafoils, they were often placed near thresholds, windows, and hearths, anywhere that was both an entrance and a vulnerability. The idea was simple. A malicious force would be drawn into tracing. The endless line looping forever, too distracted to cross. Think of it as the supernatural equivalent of giving someone a Rubik's Cube before they can walk into your kitchen. Quirky tidbits sneaks up from a dusty corner of folklore. Some believed these symbols worked better if they were carved fresh during certain moon phases, particularly a waxing crescent. The logic, if you can call it, that was that, as the moon grew, so would the protective power of the mark. Whether the village here followed that schedule is anyone's guess, but you notice that the cuts in the wood are at different depths and colors, suggesting they've been renewed over the years, like a well-loved path kept clear with steady sweeping. Historians still argue whether these carvings were officially sanctioned by clergy or simply tolerated as harmless folk custom. Some church records scold parishioners for scratching idle signs into holy wood, while others make no mention at all. It's possible ministers look the other way, especially if the marks seem to keep the congregation calm and the collection plate steady. You can almost hear the pragmatic reasoning. Better a carved flower on the door than a frightened flock skipping service. You crouch closer, running a fingertip over the groove of one looping pattern. The wood is smooth, where countless other fingers have done the same. Perhaps people touched it on their way in, a little unconscious blessing. It's like knocking on wood or crossing fingers before a speech. Joke 1. You briefly wonder if anyone ever scolded a child for doodling on the church, later realize the doodle was technically saving everyone from eternal mischief. A man in a plain brown coat is adjusting the candles on the lectern. Seeing your interest, he comes over, wiping his hands on a rag. "We call M sun marks," he says, nodding toward the carvings. "Sun keeps the shadow folk away. You let the shadow in, it'll follow you home," says it with the same tone you might use for shut the door before the heat escapes. Not fearful, just practical. Then he straightens and goes back to his work, as if that explains everything you need to know. You stand and take in the rest of the threshold. On the lintel above, almost hidden by the soot from centuries of candles, there's a faint series of letters V, or maybe WWE, either way. The symbol is another well-known protective charm, often interpreted as Virgo, Virginum, Virgin, Virgins, invoking the protection of Mary. Some scholars insist it's a Marian monogram. Others argue it's a doubled V for protective mark, the way one might draw a double line under a warning. The ambiguity doesn't seem to trouble the villagers, whatever the meaning. It's in the right place, and that's what matters. Near the base of the door, you find a tiny hole drilled into the frame, no bigger than the tip of your smallest finger. It's been plugged with something wool, perhaps, or wax. Folklore sometimes recommended such plugs as traps for evil spirits, which once lured inside, would be unable to find their way out. The size of the hole makes you think of a peephole for something that isn't supposed to see both ways. Joke 2. You imagine an annoyed imp peering out and complaining about the lack of decent reading material in there. Mainstream fact reminds you that churches often doubled as community halls, and even fortifications, which meant their doors were subject to all kinds of anxiety, weather, thieves, disease, and yes, the supernatural. Protective measures blurred the line between practical maintenance and spiritual defense. A heavy oak door might stop a person, carved symbol might stop whatever walked in dreams. Historians still argue whether these protections were more about keeping evil out or reminding those inside to keep their own behavior in line. A carved flower could be an amulet or a moral nudge after all, if you're stepping over the work of a dozen careful hands. You might think twice before causing trouble during the sermon. You glance up at the high windows, their glass wavy and imperfect, catching the candlelight in little molten distortions. In the corners of the frames, you swear you see faint scratches, almost like tally marks. Could be maintenance notes, could be another layer of warding. It's the layering that fascinates you, the way these marks build over time, each generation, adding its own quiet insurance. Someone has left a small basket near the door, filled with bits of chalk, a small knife, and shavings of wood. It's the sort of kit that might be used for mending the floor or drawing a quick line on a hymn board, but here, you suspect it has another purpose. If a mark fades, there's no sense waiting until Sunday to renew it. As you step back into the night, the cool air carries the faintest smell of rain. You close the door gently, feeling the weight of the wood and the work it carries. Out here, the symbols may be invisible to the untrained eye, but you've seen them now. Once you know where to look, the world feels just a little more crowded, with quiet guardians. Joke 3. You consider leaving a Yelp review for the meeting house. 5 stars. Door kept all evil out. Would attend again. Behind you, the church looms as a warm square against the dark. Ahead, the road curves toward more houses, more thresholds, more chances to spot the subtle language of protection. Your fingers itch to trace every groove you pass, to feel the centuries worn into them by people who, like you, walked in with one kind of burden and left with another lighter one. The lane bends gently, taking you past a low stone wall laced with ivy, and the night opens into a quieter part of the village. Here, houses seem to huddle together like gossiping neighbors, their roofs leaning in toward one another. The moon has climbed higher now, painting the road in long, pale ribbons. You find yourself scanning every doorway you pass, like someone who's been given a secret code and is determined to spot it everywhere. And you do. On the first cottage, there's a row of small, star-shaped carvings just under the thatched eaves. They're shallow, almost decorative, except they're all the same shape, evenly spaced, like a repeating charm. Mainstream historical fact explains that in early American settlements, as in older European villages, 5 or 6 pointed stars often doubled as protective marks. Not the perfect ruler-straight kind you'd find on a flag today, but hand-cut, each with its own wonky personality. They were said to confuse witches or wandering spirits, forcing them to follow the points endlessly instead of slipping inside. A quirky tidbit from the back shelf of folk belief notes that some families even baked the same star shapes into their pies or cut them into bread loaves, as if the protection could be eaten along with supper. Whether it worked or just made for a charming crust is, of course, hard to measure lest you count the absence of supernatural incidents as proof. You lean closer to the second house and spot something different. Faint chalk lines drawn in, the shape of interlocking circles right across the wooden threshold. Historians still argue whether these temporary marks were meant to be renewed daily or simply redrawn after rain. In some records, the circles are described as witch loops designed to trap evil spirits in a continuous walk. In others, they're chalk blessings from itinerant preachers or traveling tradesmen. Half ritual and half advertisement. The door here has no knocker, just a thick iron latch that gleams in the moonlight. Right beside it, a small pouch is nailed to the frame. The cloth is so weathered it's nearly the same color as the wood, but you can make out its bulging shape, likely filled with salt, herbs, or maybe even hair clippings. Joke 1. You briefly consider that it could be the world's most disappointing snack bag. A cat-striped, lean, and suspicious slips silently across the path in front of you. It pauses by the pouch, sniffs, then trots off as if unimpressed by whatever protective magic is in there. The moment makes you think about how these practices must have been as much about reassurance as about actual threat. When your world is built from wood, wool, and word of mouth, you take your defenses where you can get them. Further down the road, a much grander doorway comes into view. This one belongs to the merchant's house, with double doors carved from dark oak and polished until they reflect the lamplight. Above the arch, you notice a row of strange angular marks cut deep into the stone. Mainstream fact identifies them as mason's mark signatures left by the craftsman who built the doorway, but in many communities, these same marks were believed to carry protective power. Their geometric precision warding off harm, quirky. Detail slips in. Some stonemasons were known to subtly alter their marks if they didn't like the homeowner, introducing a flaw they claimed was purely decorative. Whether that flaw weakened the magic or was just an inside joke between craftsmen remains one of those charmingly petty mysteries of history. A door opens a crack nearby, and a woman in a faded wimple peers out. She watches you glance up at the carvings and says softly, "Stone remembers, longer than wood." Then, just as quickly, she shuts the door again. Her words hang in the air, like a reminder that what's carved in oak may need renewal, but what's cut in stone will keep watch. For centuries, on the last house before the road turns to open fields, you see a doorway that's practically a catalog of protective measures. There's a daisy wheel carved into the lintel, a chalk loop on the doorstep, dried herbs hanging from a nail, and most unusual, a row of small glass beads embedded in the frame. They catch the moonlight like tiny frozen drops, historians still argue whether such beads were decorative, trade goods, or deliberately placed as talismans to refract light and confuse evil eyes. Either way, the effect is mesmerizing. You imagine walking through that door every night, passing under the gaze of every mark, herb, and bead, knowing you've layered your home with centuries of folk wisdom. Joke 2. You'd probably still double-check that you locked it, just in case. A breeze carries the faint smell of something sweet, maybe. Someone's baking for the morning, and it mixes with the earthier scent of damp timber. You keep walking, shoes sinking slightly into the softening road, and the sound of your footsteps blends with the distant rush of leaves in the wind, up ahead. The moonlight catches on something odd, a freestanding frame, like a doorway without a house. The wood is weathered but still upright, and across the top beam, there's a line of unfamiliar symbols burned into the grain. You step closer. Tracing them with your eyes, they might be letters, or they might just be shapes. No one's here to explain it. Maybe it was a gate. Maybe it was part of a barn. Maybe it was simply a protective threshold that never needed walls. Joke 3. You think about putting it in your own yard, just to see if the neighbors start walking in circles around it. The road curves again, and you glance back. All those doorways, all those quiet guardians, seem to glow faintly in your memory, as if they're still watching you leave. The village sleeps behind them, trusting in symbols that might have started as faith or fear, or maybe just habit, but have survived long enough to become part of the wood and stone itself. The path takes you out toward the edge of the village, where the houses grow sparser and the fields stretch into open darkness. The air here feels cleaner, cooler, as if it's shaken off the layers of smoke and cooking smells that hang closer. To the main street ahead, you can see the outline of a small chapel, its simple wooden steeple silhouetted against the star-pocked sky. You push open the creaky gate, complains in that long, groaning way gates do when they haven't been oiled since the reign of, well, probably the last monarch you learned about in school, and step onto the worn path. The chapel's doorway is plain, but the longer you look, the more details emerge. At first, it's the big things. A carved cross on the lintel, the faint remnants of red paint in its grooves. But then you notice the subtle marks scratched into the frame, almost invisible in this dim light. A mainstream historical fact tells you that church doorways often doubled as liminal spaces, thresholds, between the safety of the sacred and the unpredictability of the world outside. Marks here could be both decorative and protective, an unspoken promise to those who entered that they were crossing into a different kind of safety. There's a quirky little detail just at knee height, a small, neat circle drilled right into the wood, no bigger than a coin. Looks accidental, but local lore claims such holes could catch evil spirits before they followed a worshiper inside, like a supernatural trap that needed no bait. You lean in closer, and the grain of the wood seems to shimmer slightly under your gaze. Historians still argue whether these protective designs were sanctioned by the clergy or quietly added by local craftsmen and parishioners without official approval. The church's position on magic and superstition could change depending on the decade or the personality of the vicar, so some marks may have been blessed, while others were just tolerated. Stepping back, you spot a different kind of charm, just above the doorframe. Tucked into a crack between the boards is a yellowed feather tied with thin twine. It's so fragile that a strong breeze might carry it away, yet it's clearly been there long enough to become part of the building's story. Maybe it's from a goose, maybe a chicken. There's no way to tell now, but the image of someone quietly placing it there, perhaps after a bad dream or a strange noise in the night, is oddly moving. Joke 1. You're tempted to add a feather yourself, but knowing your luck, it would just blow away before anyone noticed. Inside, chapel smells faintly of beeswax and damp wool. You don't go all the way in. This isn't your village after all, but you linger in the doorway, noticing how the space beyond feels warmer, softer, as though the very walls have absorbed centuries of whispered prayers. You imagine a winter's evening here, with the congregation huddled together for warmth, candles throwing long shadows up the whitewashed walls. As you turn to leave, the moonlight falls just right, illuminating something almost invisible at the edge of the doorframe. A series of tiny letters carved so shallow they look like scratches. They might be initials, or they might be an old charm in code. Either way, they've survived weather, repairs, and who knows how many changing hands. It's a reminder that a protective mark isn't just about guarding against harm, it's about leaving a trace. A quiet declaration that someone was here, watching over this place. Joke 2. You realize that in the modern world, the closest equivalent might be someone putting googly eyes on a lamppost. You walk back down the path, glancing over your shoulder one last time. The chapel stands quiet, the doorway dark now that the moon has shifted. Picture the marks and charms scattered across the village, each one a silent sentinel. They're so small, so easy to miss, yet together they weave an invisible net. Over the community, somewhere far off, an owl calls, its voice low and steady. You let the sound settle into you, the way you might tuck a blanket tighter on a cold night. This is the last stretch of the journey, and you find your pace slowing. The fields on either side are silvered by moonlight, the path ahead blurring into the horizon. You breathe in the crisp night air, letting it fill your lungs with that faint scent of earth and grass. And you carry with you the image of every doorway, every carved line, every hidden charm you've passed. Joke 3. You briefly wonder if your own front door at home would feel jealous if it knew about all these charms. In the stillness, it occurs to you that maybe these protective symbols worked not just by warding off evil, but by reassuring the people who made them. Like a whispered goodnight, they told the household, you are watched over. And maybe that belief in itself was the strongest kind of magic. Asterisk, the road narrows until it's just a ribbon between shadow and starlight. The night air is so still that you can hear the tiny rustle of leaves settling after a breeze, and somewhere, in the grass, the faint rhythmic chirp of crickets. You slow your steps, letting your thoughts drift the way they might in that quiet space just before sleep. The images of the village play softly in your mind. Doorways framed in oak and stone, chalk marks fading in the rain, tiny carved stars catching the moonlight. You picture them not as relics, but as living things, each one carrying the touch of the hands that made them. Your shoulders ease, and you feel the day's weight slipping away. The world here seems suspended, like a held breath, but not tense, just waiting. The kind of waiting that feels patient, unhurried, as if time itself moves differently in this place. You imagine stepping through one of those marked doorways, leaving the cool night behind. The air inside is warm, touched with the scent of wood smoke and herbs. You close the door gently, and the marks above you seem to hum with quiet approval. Safe inside, you can hear the soft patter of rain beginning, each drop another layer of comfort. The sound fades until it's part of your breathing, slow and steady. The room is dim, the light low, and your eyes grow heavy. You don't need to think about the charms anymore. They're just there. It's part of the walls, part of the night, part of the way this place holds you. And as you let go, drifting into that, Gentle space between waking and sleep. The last thing you feel is the sense that you are, and always have been, protected.